Welcome. My name is Cedar Michelle. I'm with the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, and I'm happy to be facilitating this session with you all today. Our session dealing with financial support strategies for homelessness prevention and housing stability. So we're going to hear from three groups of speakers today. But first of all, I just wanted to give a quick land acknowledgement. So, as you've probably heard, the 2024 National Conference on Ending Homelessness is being held on the traditional unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin peoples. The peoples of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation have lived on this territory since time immemorial. Their culture and presence have nurtured and continue to nurture this land. We acknowledge and celebrate the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples from coast to coast who participate in this conference and lead the work to end homelessness across Turtle Island. So as I mentioned before, that we'll have presentations in both English and French during this session. So if there is a language that you're not comfortable in, it's okay to leave, to go get the headphones and just come back. But we do encourage everybody to stay and to participate in all of the sessions because they're all dealing with the same themes. So we're going to have our three presenters, each for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have a half hour of discussion at the end when you can ask questions of any presenters. We'll have a wireless mic. So I'll just be kind of up at the front and you can catch my attention and I'll bring the mic to you. So to get started, I guess I want to turn it over to our first group of presenters. I'll let each of you introduce yourselves.
Bonjour et merci. Je suis Fiona Crossling, directrice générale de l'Accueil Bonneau à Montréal. I'm Fiona, Executive Director of Accueil Bonneau in Montreal. And we will be presenting in French, but please feel free afterwards to ask any questions you like in English or French. Donc, ça me fait plaisir aujourd'hui de vous présenter un projet sur lequel nous travaillons depuis 2 ans, vraiment quand on cherche à regarder une structure ou un modèle d'affaires régional pour la région montréalaise. Mais c'est un projet sur lequel l'Accueil Bonneau travaille depuis plus de 50 ans. Alors, c'est quelque chose qui a été commencé vraiment local dans notre organisme avec, disons, une centaine de participants qui a grandi. On desserve presque 400 personnes maintenant dans notre fiducie à l'Accueil Bonneau et on est en train de mettre en place une structure que nous allons vous présenter qui va s'étaler sur la région montréalaise. Je viens de l'Accueil Bonneau, je suis accompagnée de mes collègues Maxime et Nathalie qui travaillent également à l'Accueil Bonneau, mais c'est un projet qu'on fait en partenariat avec la FOM, donc la Fédération des OSBL en habitation de Montréal, financé par le CIUS Centre-Sud. Bon, je vais vous faire une petite introduction sur le projet, définir certains termes. On va vous parler des études que nous avons effectuées avant d'embarquer dans la détermination du modèle d'affaires, les résultats qui sont attendus par ce projet pilote qui s'étale sur quelques années, ça finit en 2026, le modèle qui est proposé, le rôle de l'expérience vécue dans tout cela et l'implantation. Alors, je vais commencer, Maxime va enchaîner, puis c'est Nathalie qui va terminer la présentation pour nous. Bon, comme je viens de vous dire, c'est un projet pilote qui s'étale de 2022 à 2026. Dans les 2 premières années, on a travaillé beaucoup sur les sondages, les projets, la recherche, qu'est-ce qu'on peut apprendre sur les projets de fiducie existants à Montréal, bien sûr, mais ailleurs dans le monde. On a développé tout ce travail qu'on a fait de modèle d'affaires avec notre partenaire la FOM et comme je viens de vous dire, c'est financé par le plan d'action interministériel en itinérance 7.1. Bon, quelques définitions. C'est quoi une fiducie volontaire? Puis honnêtement, j'adore le terme fiducie volontaire, puis en anglais, je trouve pas de bonne traduction. I guess it's a trust in English, mais la fiducie volontaire veut un service d'accompagnement offert aux personnes en situation de vulnérabilité et de précarité, donc pas forcément en situation d'itinérance. Un suivi qui est personnalisé dans l'administration de son budget et ça peut être très détaillé comme ça peut être très simple. C'est un recours à ce service pour payer son loyer d'abord et je dirais que comme 100% des personnes, c'est ça qu'ils veulent. Puis après ça, il y a d'autres services qui peuvent s'en ajouter selon le besoin de la personne, comme payer ses factures, ses dettes et ses dépenses personnelles. C'est le soutien d'un intervenant qui aide à développer des notions de gestion budgétaire et à retrouver l'autonomie financière du participant. Et il faut souligner que l'adhésion au service est complètement volontaire et flexible. Donc, ça veut dire que la personne peut décider qu'il ne veut plus participer à la fiducie et on ne veut pas non plus que la personne reste éternellement. Le but, c'est que la personne retrouve son autonomie. On a fait, en 2023, on a effectué une étude sur l'offre existante. Donc, je vois certains collègues du secteur de l'itinérance à Montréal ici dans la salle. Nous ne sommes pas le seul organisme qui offre un service de fiducie. Ça existe ailleurs. Les points forts que les gens nous ont comme indiqués dans les différents fiducies qui existent, c'est la grande capacité d'adaptation. On sait que nos organismes sont très flexibles. Ça facilite les liens de confiance. Une chose qui est sortie très fortement, c'est que les gens qui ont besoin d'un accompagnement en fiducie ne font pas confiance aux grandes banques, aux institutions financières. Ils font confiance à un intervenant ou une intervenante dans l'organisme. La stabilisation des personnes participantes. On voit qu'avec un soutien en fiducie, leur situation de stabilité résidentielle est améliorée et grandement, mais aussi sa consommation souvent est réduite. Donc, pourquoi? Parce qu'il y a une chute de stress assez remarquant et on reconnaît l'expertise du personnel. Par contre, on a constaté plusieurs points faibles. Parmi ce point, un manque de main-d'œuvre. Normalement, les organismes qui offrent une fiducie, ils offrent ça avec les employés qui font plein d'autres choses aussi. Les participants peuvent développer une dépendance au service. C'est pas ça du tout qu'on vise. Il y a la possibilité d'erreurs transactionnelles et la lourdeur administrative. On s'entend que lorsqu'on offre des accompagnements psychosociaux, c'est pas vraiment gérer les bases de données, les transactions bancaires, tout l'aspect de la comptabilité, c'est pas vraiment la force de tout le monde. Et les outils de formation ne sont pas adaptés aux besoins. Donc, on a fait le tour des formations qui existaient, puis ne sont pas vraiment adaptés à notre clientèle. Donc, à retenir, il y avait un désir généralisé d'élargir l'offre de fiducie, mais qu'il y avait un manque important de ressources et de capacités. Dans presque, je dirais 90% des cas, il n'y avait aucun financement pour les services de fiducie qui étaient offerts dans les organismes. Alors, l'autre côté du médaille, l'étude des besoins, les services actuels étaient peu ou pas accessibles. L'offre était beaucoup inférieure aux besoins. Donc, dans la majorité des cas, on fait aucune publicité par rapport aux services qui sont offerts parce qu'on veut absolument pas que trop de monde vienne parce qu'on n'a pas le personnel ni les autres ressources pour les accueillir. Souvent, les services étaient réservés à un groupe populationnel très spécifique. Et c'était le cas chez nous aussi. On desservait que nos résidents. On ne pouvait pas accueillir à ce moment-là les gens qui venaient au centre de jour, les gens qui étaient peut-être dans des situations de précarité, dans une maison de chambre autre que chez nous. On a aussi constaté que certaines zones géographiques étaient très mal desservies. Et là, je parle de l'île de Montréal. Dans l'Est, dans l'Ouest, dans le Nord, il n'y avait presque pas de services. Et les plus grands besoins qu'on a vus étaient vraiment pour le paiement du loyer et des dépenses courantes. On voulait aussi de l'aide pour la réception et l'encaissement des chèques, pour les revenus, prestations, etc. Retrait d'argent comptant et l'accompagnement personnalisé, c'est en gras parce que c'est en gras. C'est vraiment ça dont les gens ont besoin. Bon, avec le modèle qu'on voulait mettre en place, on a comme défini ensemble quels sont les résultats attendus. C'est un outil incroyable pour la prévention de l'itinérance, soit pour prévenir un retour à la rue ou une première expérience en itinérance. Vous savez comme moi combien ça coûte cher, non seulement financièrement, mais psychologiquement, si quelqu'un perd son logement et doit retourner dans une ressource, trouver un autre endroit où rester. Mais si on pouvait déjà identifier ceux qui ont de la difficulté à payer leur loyer, leur offrir cet accompagnement, bien, c'est beaucoup plus efficace. assure une stabilité financière aux personnes en situation d'itinérance. Alors, on voit maintenant de plus en plus de gens qui sont encore dans la rue, mais veulent mieux gérer leur argent. Puis ça, c'est quelque chose. Amélioration de leur situation financière et de leur stabilité résidentielle, ça, c'est clair qu'on le voit, puis on veut augmenter le nombre de personnes qui sont plus stables. On veut développer l'autonomie financière des gens, réduire les risques liés à la consommation et aux dépendances, donc la réduction de la consommation. Et on veut développer avec les gens, les participants, leur pouvoir d'agir et la défense des droits. Donc, les résultats attendus. Avec tout ça, on a essayé de rendre quelque chose qui peut parfois paraître complexe en quelque chose qui est très simple. Donc, notre toile d'araignée ici, c'est vraiment simple. On a quelques joueurs dans ce modèle d'affaires. Vous voyez au centre, il y a une instance en vert, l'instance centrale. Après ça, il y a des points de service. Les points de service représentent les organismes communautaires et autres qui veulent offrir à leur clientèle un service de fiducie volontaire. L'instance centrale, c'est géré à l'Accueil Bonneau, puis je vais vous parler des services que nous offrons à l'intérieur de cette instance centrale avec notre partenaire, la FOM. Nous arrivons avec 50 ans d'expérience en gérant une fiducie. La FOM arrive avec son grande expérience avec le logement communautaire et tous ses membres. Les points de service, eux, ils pourront aussi non seulement offrir le service à leurs membres, mais selon leur emplacement dans la ville, aussi avoir des points de référencement, des plus petits organismes qui accompagnent peut-être quelqu'un dans une banque alimentaire. Apprend que quelqu'un est sur le point de perdre son logement. Il fait confiance à un membre du personnel dans cette banque alimentaire. Il l'accompagne vers le point de service. Qui fait quoi dans le modèle d'affaires? Il y a un comité exécutif qui assure la gouvernance, la reddition de comptes, assure le financement. Nous, les partenaires clés, notre partenaire financier, c'est la Caisse d'économie solidaire, et assure le pilotage du projet. L'instance centrale, nous, on s'occupe de la gestion financière du projet. On assure la gestion des comptes des participants, donc chaque participant a un compte. On assure tout le travail bancaire, donc on s'assure qu'il y a du cash qui est disponible à chacun des points de service et on assure tout ce qu'on appelle le back-office et la comptabilité. Les points de service, eux, ils s'assurent de la relation humaine. C'est vraiment la clé du succès des fiducies. Assurent le lien entre les participants et les services de fiducie et le soutien et l'accompagnement des participants. Le participant ou la participante, elle bénéficie de la participation au projet pilote, choisit son plan de suivi, qu'est-ce qu'il veut, quels sont ses objectifs, et il participe aux rencontres avec les intervenants dans les différents points de service. Je vais passer la parole à Maxime qui va parler un peu du fonctionnement.
Merci Fiona. Bonjour tout le monde. Je suis très content d'être ici aujourd'hui pour vous parler du projet. Comme on le disait, comme Fiona le disait, au niveau de la répartition des services, on parlait de paiement de loyer au minimum. Donc, le service de base qui est offert à tout le monde pour permettre justement la prévention. Donc, le service est préventif parce qu'on va acquérir des nouvelles personnes qui n'ont jamais connu l'itinérance. Paiement de loyer, c'est le minimum qui est offert à tout le monde. Incluant, comme je le disais, aux gens qui sont en logement puis qui ont de la difficulté à y arriver. Ce que vous pouvez voir sur la diapositive, c'est des services en vert puis des services en orange. Donc, ce qui est en vert est assuré par l'instance centrale. Donc, ce qui est en orange est assuré par les points de service. Donc, en services principaux qui sont offerts aux personnes, on a donc, comme je le disais, le paiement du loyer, on a aussi paiement des factures et des dettes. On a le retrait d'argent comptant. Donc, les gens peuvent aller au point de service et retirer de l'argent en cash. On a aussi dépôt d'argent après fiducie, transfert d'argent entre comptes bancaires. Donc, les services afférents, qui sont donc des services qui complètent l'offre de services principaux, donc on a tout ce qui est le volet littératie financière. Donc, l'accompagnement et le suivi psychosocial, l'accompagnement à la gestion budgétaire, donc gérer son budget, le soutien dans la régularisation de sa situation administrative, parce qu'on le sait que des fois, il y a des gens qui n'ont pas leur carte d'assurance maladie, qui n'ont pas, donc ils sont pas réglementaires par rapport au système, donc ils n'ont pas accès, par exemple, à des aides sociales, etc. Donc, il faut régulariser la situation avant qu'ils puissent y avoir accès. Donc, comme je le disais, l'aide à l'ouverture d'un compte bancaire, le service de clinique d'impôt, l'accompagnement dans les dossiers d'aide sociale, justement, comme je le disais, le contrôle des dépenses liées à la consommation et aux dépendances, budget, le service de boîte postale pour les personnes, par exemple, qui n'auraient pas de domicile, et un service aussi qui est assuré par l'instance centrale de formation aux intervenants et aux caissiers. Donc, il y a un outil technologique facilitateur, une colonne vertébrale ou un moteur qui nous permet d'accomplir le projet. Donc, c'est l'outil de gestion Salesforce sur lequel on se base. Donc, ce que vous pouvez voir sur la diapo, vous pouvez voir à droite, donc les transactions, donc la gestion des transactions. Donc, on a différentes catégories de transactions, transactions planifiées, transactions, donc complétées, transactions, etc. Donc, dans le compte personnel de chaque personne. Donc, ce que vous voyez, en fait, c'est la fiche pour chaque personne. Ce que vous voyez à gauche aussi, c'est des statistiques de comment ça évolue la situation financière à chaque mois pour chaque personne. Donc, voir l'évolution de comment ça se passe pour la personne. Donc, on a un portrait global comme ça dans Salesforce. Puis, ce qui est intéressant avec cet outil-là, c'est que c'est un outil qui nous permet, ce qui permet au point de service d'alimenter la base de données et en même temps, à l'instance centrale, en temps réel, d'avoir les mêmes données. Sinon, au niveau de la sécurité des données, une des raisons pour lesquelles on est allé vers Salesforce, c'est que c'est un logiciel qui est très gros et la sécurité des données est très importante, très forte. La même chose pour la confidentialité des données, qui est quelque chose d'extrêmement important pour nous. Donc, Salesforce nous permet aussi d'avoir une confidentialité qui est très forte aussi. Puis aussi pour ce qui est de la flexibilité et l'adaptabilité. Donc, ce qu'on écrit en anglais scalability, qui nous permet en fait de pouvoir développer le modèle de plus en plus gros dans le futur. Donc, je passe la parole à Nathalie.
Je suis contente, je me suis rendue sans tomber, parce que je suis une genre qui tombe. Alors, voici, moi je vais vous parler qu'est-ce que la fiducie peut avoir comme avantage sur les personnes qui y participent. En premier lieu, quand une personne sort dans la rue et se retrouve à avoir un logement, on peut pas dire qu'elle est tout de suite dans un sentiment de sécurité ou sécurisée. La personne doit reprendre le contrôle de sa vie, justement partir de la survie et commencer à vivre, et aussi d'être capable de reprendre les responsabilités qui se rattachent à un logement. Il y en a qui continuent à dormir à terre avant d'être capable de pouvoir réintégrer un lit. Donc, on peut imaginer que payer son loyer, c'est quelque chose qui peut être très difficile. Alors, ça permet une sécurité. Parce que les gens vont donner l'argent par la fiducie. On assure de payer leur loyer et le reste de l'argent leur est donné selon leur volonté. Il y en a que c'est une fois par mois et il y en a d'autres que c'est un montant par semaine. Donc, ils viennent à chaque fois que la fiducie est ouverte, donc 2 fois par semaine. Alors, elles sont référées, ces personnes, soit par un point de référencement, comme on a parlé tout à l'heure, ou encore par des intervenants ou des intervenantes qui vont suggérer à la personne que ça pourrait être intéressant pour elle pour pouvoir se sentir plus sécurisée et de pouvoir donc mettre son attention sur sa propre guérison, son rétablissement, sa réaffiliation, quel que soit l'état où la personne est. Et elle va aussi choisir le plan de soutien dont elle a besoin. Par exemple, on paye le loyer, mais c'est possible aussi de payer d'autres types de factures, par exemple l'Internet, ou encore des dettes. Parfois, les personnes en situation d'itinérance ont contracté plusieurs dettes, ou encore des tickets d'infraction, et donc on consolide les dettes, on aide la personne à consolider ses dettes et de pouvoir les payer par montant mensuel. Il y a aussi la possibilité, ce qui est en train de se développer avec la fiducie solidaire régionale, c'est d'offrir des formations pour que les personnes puissent développer leur autonomie financière, d'être capable de faire un budget. D'apprendre aussi, en faisant son budget, d'identifier les lignes ou nous on parle de lignes, mais les items qui sont les plus coûteuses. Par exemple, on va leur parler de combien vous mettez ou tu mets dans ta consommation par semaine. Et souvent, ça fait prendre conscience à la personne que ce qu'elle mettait dans la consommation est un montant qui était l'équivalent ou plus qu'un loyer. Et parfois, il y a des personnes qu'on a accompagnées qui ont pris la décision d'arrêter de consommer parce qu'elle a pris conscience de comment la consommation prenait tout l'espace de sa vie. Et parce que aussi cette personne était libérée du stress de perdre sa maison ou son lieu d'habitat, la perte du stress les permettait de plus avoir besoin de consommer autant. Ensuite, on offre aussi d'autres types d'accompagnement, par exemple de consolider les dettes ou autres. Et parfois, l'intervention peut aller plus loin que uniquement le volet financier. Alors, on a donc commencé l'implantation en 2024. Nous avons donc 3 points de service. Le premier est au sud de Montréal. On en a un dans l'est de Montréal et au nord de Montréal. Donc, on essaie d'aller rejoindre le plus de personnes possible. Et en 2025, on veut en ouvrir 2 autres. Il y a déjà quelqu'un qui s'est manifesté dans l'ouest de Montréal, donc on va avoir fait les points cardinaux. Puis, on va identifier en cours de route un autre organisme, qui va vouloir se joindre à nous. Toutefois, Fiona l'a mentionné, on a reçu un financement qui va jusqu'en 2026. Mais on pense que ce service devrait continuer pour des personnes qui sont encore dessus, parce que certaines personnes vont avoir besoin d'y rester plus longtemps, mais aussi pour pouvoir rejoindre d'autres personnes qui se retrouvent en difficulté financière et en précarité surtout de logement. Alors, pour ce faire, on a décidé de faire un projet de recherche avec Nick Falvo qui va parler tout à l'heure, mais il ne parlera pas de ce projet de recherche, mais on en parlera à une prochaine conférence ici, où on veut, en fait, notre hypothèse, c'est que la fiducie contribue significativement à la stabilité résidentielle et aussi au développement de l'autonomie du pouvoir d'agir des personnes. Donc, c'est ce que nous allons mesurer. Et on veut travailler sur une structure de gouvernance qui pourrait rendre la fiducie quelque chose de pérenne dans le temps. Et évidemment, de voir un plan de croissance pour pouvoir intéresser des futurs bailleurs de fonds pour permettre sa continuité. Et pour terminer, si vous êtes intéressé à ouvrir un point de service, quel que soit l'emplacement au Québec ou même, j'ai vu qu'à Ottawa, on a des caisses des jardins, Alors, même Ottawa pourrait se joindre à nous. Et donc, vous pouvez rejoindre Maxime, qui est le responsable du projet. Je vous remercie.
Si jamais il y a des nerds dans le groupe, Maxime est disponible après pour vous montrer comment fonctionne la base de données. So if you're into Salesforce, Maxime can show you at the end if you like.
Which one's you?
I don't see ours there. I mean, I know where it is in the desktop.
Okay.
Oh. No, that's not ours. I can find it if you, okay. So if we go here. Slideshow. Do I just go?
Okay, perfect.
All right. My name's Nick Falvo. I'm going to do the first part of our presentation. Erik's going to do the last part, actually most of it. Erik and I'm a Calgary-based research consultant, and I've worked with Erik Latimer on this project. Erik is based in Montreal. The project was based on the Quebec situation, so it was an honor to work with somebody who was an absolute expert on the Quebec housing and homelessness setting. So our skills complemented each other rather well. This report we're going to talk about was born out of a really neat collaborative that Erik helped start along with Jim Hughes and others called the Quebec Homelessness Prevention Policy Collaborative. They got started on this collaborative, we got to talking, and we all approached the province of Quebec to fund a research project. It started with one ministry, they had a reorg, then it went to a different agency. We can get into that later if you want. Bad news is the report itself is available only in French. However, there's a blog post available in English and in French, and I'll be speaking in English, and I don't even know if Erik's decided if he's going to speak in English or French. Yeah.
Probably English.
Okay. Here's something I want to make clear right off the bat. In the housing policy literature, most experts agree that housing affordability is extremely important, that there isn't enough affordable housing in almost any jurisdiction of the world. But in terms of how you address that, there are two main types of approaches: supply side and demand side. With supply side, you're rendering the rent cheap. You're creating housing that has low rent levels. Think community housing, also known as social housing, for example. You're intervening to create supply and create a good rent level for low-income folks to afford. With demand side, you're kind of accepting the market rent as a given, and you're helping low-income households afford that expensive rent. Now, there is technically possible to do supply and demand at the same time. That's a bit more complicated. I won't get into that, just to keep it simple. Supply side and demand side approaches, Erik and I would both agree, are very important. In fact, the report outlines that, discusses the debate a little bit, and even makes recommendations to the effect that supply side approaches are very important. Supply side approaches have lots of objectives that demand side approaches don't. With supply side approaches, you might target an entire neighborhood and say this neighborhood needs more community housing. You might target specific households and saying this specific type of household is neglected in our housing market. We need to create new stock for this group, maybe persons with disabilities, for example. You might, with supply side approaches, you have the option of creating common space for activities in a supportive housing project, for example. With demand side, it's more about helping people afford the rent. I would say it's a bit simpler in some respects and has maybe narrower objectives tied to the household as opposed to community-wide or long-term objectives with broader objectives, right? So supply side has its role, demand side has its role. Canada underinvests in both, as slide 9 makes quite clear here. Greg Sutter, a Toronto-based researcher, has looked at the spending patterns of Canada versus other OECD countries. Canada, relative to other countries, most of you already know, does not have as much community housing on a per capita basis. Ray Sullivan talks about that a lot. But also on the demand side, we don't spend as much as a percentage of our GDP as other OECD countries. So Canada underinvests on the supply side and on the demand side. That's important context to know. This report is focusing on demand side approaches while understanding and appreciating that both approaches play a role. Quebec's got two main types of demand side approaches, demand side programs. The English terms are rent supplement program and shelter allowance program. Each is different. One is shallower. We looked at both of them with emphasis on the rent supplement program. For this research, we did a lit review that includes a look at the demand side, supply side debate. I conducted 34 one-on-one interviews with experts in Quebec. Eric and I co-facilitated 10 different focus groups with different types of stakeholders. And we did what I would call in English a blue sky discussion, had a different term in French, where we talked about what would an ideal system look like in terms of demand side approaches. That is the front end of the presentation. Eric is going to take it from here.
All right, thank you, Nick. So what we're going to be discussing here is these two programs that Nick outlined. The first is called in French, Programme Allocation Logement. So it's a housing allowance program which offers either $100, $150, or $170 per month. It is for households that have a dependent child or at least one household member that is 50 or over. So a single adult under 50 is not eligible for it at present. You must apply for it in all cases. As of September 30th, 2023, about 125,000 households, that's about 3.3% of Quebec households, benefited from this program. It is actually managed by Revenu Québec, the Quebec Revenue Agency, and eligible households are notified that they are eligible for it. So in terms of the strengths of this program, people didn't particularly mention strengths of these programs. Implicitly, it's a good program, but it's just that it doesn't go far enough. So the amounts that I described were viewed as too low, although they increased in the early 2020s, but they're still very low in light of the rapid increase in rents. The eligibility criteria, particularly the age-related criterion, seems too strict. And it's not a very visible program, even though you may get a notice from Revenu Québec that you're eligible for it. For a lot of low-income people with mental illnesses, young people who are still very disorganized and learning how to fill out forms, and so on, receiving that notice really doesn't change anything. The end result is you don't receive the benefit. One respondent said, I'm just saying it for the sake of completeness, a psychiatrist said that he was concerned that benefits would be spent on alcohol or drugs. So it's good to have some form of trusteeship connecting with the earlier presentation. Now, the main program, as Nick mentioned, that we looked at was the Programme Supplément au Loyer, now Programme Supplément au Loyer Québec, and this was actually a difficult project to do because, well, if we had done it extremely quickly, it wouldn't have been so bad, but we did take a while to work through it, and the program kept changing as we were studying it. So there was a marked change before, or rather right after March 31, 2023. So this is a program that covers part of the rent. The individual spends only 25% of their income on the rent, and the rest is paid by the program, but up to a ceiling, which has varied, but which is still under $1,000. In 2021, which was the most recent number we got, 34,000 households approximately were on it, so less than 1%. You can't receive both of those programs at once. And at the time, there were 8 specific programs, including the Programme Supplément Loyer, emergency, and subsidy for municipalities. So the first part of the PSLU was for low-income households experiencing or at risk of homelessness. So a strength of this program is that it allows a large choice of apartments. That's a benefit relative to social housing, where you might have just a few limited options. It encourages social mixing, people of different income levels being in the same building, not everybody necessarily being having issues with a history of homelessness or drugs or whatever. It's less stigmatized than being in social housing, and it facilitates later admission into social housing for elderly. But we were told about lots of shortcomings, excessively strict eligibility criteria, insufficient amounts, difficult to assemble the required documentation, often long approval delays. The rent supplement is attached to a housing unit. It's a way for the Société d'habitation du Québec, in effect, to increase the stock of housing that is kind of socially managed, but it doesn't follow the individual. Often the penalties for not following the rules were viewed as excessive, like being barred for the next 3 years from participation in any program. And for many landlords, it's just not very interesting to participate in this program. We heard other comments. I don't have a ton of time, but in many cases, the restriction that you have to be in a region for 12 months doesn't apply very well. For example, if you've just immigrated to Quebec, or you're a woman fleeing domestic violence and you're now in a different region, you don't want to have to wait that long. Youth also move around a lot. It certainly used to be that you needed to present your notice of assessment, which required having filed a tax return the previous year, which oftentimes, for example, young people would not have done, or immigrants, recent immigrants wouldn't have done either. The punitive aspect I've mentioned a little bit, and the government recognizes, it's clear in the Interministerial Action Plan in Homelessness, that we want to combine the rent supplement with psychosocial supports, but those supports are often inadequate. And sometimes they're required, but the person actually doesn't need them. For example, a woman fleeing domestic violence may, once her crisis situation is resolved, not actually need the accompaniment to continue. So after March 31, 2023, it became the Programme Supplément Loyer Québec. 7 of the 8 programs were replaced by a single one. Some flexibility was introduced, simplified documentation, possible to move without penalty. Office d'habitation can access $10,000, now it's even more, to cover the cost of repair quickly. Now we come to what we end up suggesting as possible improvements. Render all low-income households eligible, remove the age criterion, as is the case in Manitoba, increase the amounts, give the housing benefit to households on social assistance or disability benefits automatically, again, as is done in Manitoba currently. Also, so to say a bit more about the rent assist in Manitoba. So as I mentioned, recipients of social assistance, disability benefits get this automatically. All recipients of social assistance are eligible regardless of age. The amounts are more generous overall, even in Manitoba, which is not a particularly rich province. For example, a single adult below 50 receives a total of $890, including $616 in rent allowance, whereas it's about $804 in Quebec, because they don't get the housing benefit. An adult below 55 with a net income of about $10,000 would get a housing allowance of $390 per month, thus more than our maximum of $170. $482 if they're 55 or over. And the amount of the housing allowance is, by law, adjusted to reflect the median market rent in Winnipeg. Now, the Finnish formula is maybe a bit complicated to explain, and I don't think I have the time to go into the details, but our report is now available in French, but in brief, it's a more complex formula that takes into account household composition, household income, and it's much more adjustable. It takes into account like the surface area of the apartment and gives a maximum surface area beyond which kind of your rent supplement is not adjusted. Your housing benefit is not adjusted. So I'll skip over that bit, but it applies to any housing. It takes into account variables that seem reasonable. Its adjustability and generosity mean that one single program does the job of two programs in Quebec. But the program is expensive. It was more than 1.5 billion euros recently for a country with even fewer inhabitants than Quebec, 5.6 million people. A center-right, not to say right government, was elected several months ago, and they reduced the amount of the benefit. So possible improvements, we suggest we should have broader eligibility criteria, reduced approval delays, flexibility in imposing penalties, and improve measures to encourage landlords to sign agreements. So this touches on the key issue of relationships with landlords. There's a lot of variability in Quebec in how effective different SRA programs, Housing First programs, are in managing relationships with landlords. We could free more apartments for homeless individuals if all programs managed landlord relationships more optimally. So we end up with asking the question, what's the best way to make relationships with landlords as flexible as possible? One avenue is to do as they do in Quebec City, where they have a program called Clé en Main, which manages the relationship with the Office d'Habitation. The Office d'Habitation is much more flexible than in several other regions in the province, notably Montreal. Staff in Housing First programs can get an apartment approved in a matter of a day or two instead of weeks or months, as happens in Montreal. So if we can't do things as they do it in Quebec City, kind of our next best solution would be or perhaps the optimal solution, but it wouldn't involve an Office d'Habitation, would be for the rent supplement to be given directly to the Housing First team. And that would resolve the issue, as was done in the Projet Chez Soi several years ago, and even after that, under the SPLI. So I'll just conclude with limitations of the report. Our method was to base ourselves on comments from stakeholders, so we didn't necessarily hear about the most optimal solutions if nobody had thought of them. And as Nick emphasized at the beginning of the presentation, our focus has been on the demand side. We entirely acknowledge that we also need to be building more social housing. So the report is now available. You can contact me if you would like a link to the report. It's on the site of the Société d'Habitation du Québec since last week. and it will also be on the Bibliothèque et Archives nationales du Québec shortly. Thank you.
Yeah, you want to come? No, okay. They don't want to come? All right. All right, last presentation, last session. Let's do this. Hold on. Okay. Okay. So we're all here because we're in an affordable housing crisis. I want to give you a bit of a snapshot of what that looks like in the city of Toronto. We have almost 93,000 households that are active on the social housing wait list. We have over 10,000 people who are in our emergency shelter system, and that's 1,000 of which are unaccompanied youth who are between the ages of 16 and 24. That's the focus of this presentation, unaccompanied youth. Our vacancy rate is under 2%, and the average market rent in the city for one bedroom is just over $1,700. And I will say that that is across the whole city, and the downtown core is much more than that. So given the demand side discussion that we're having, one way that the Ontario and federal governments have tried to respond to this is through the institution of a benefit called the Canada-Ontario Housing Benefit. And this is a really great benefit, especially when you're saying these people received $100 in yours. This is a portable rent subsidy, so folks can take it anywhere in Ontario. It's multi-year, so right now recipients are receiving it until 2029, and it's rent geared to income. So a simple version of the formula is that it is the difference between 80% of average market rent, as defined by CMHC, and 30% of income. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the COB, particularly the impact it has had on youth experiencing homelessness in Toronto. We're going to talk about our research as well. I'll start by talking about what is COB, who gets COB, the potential for youth experiencing homelessness, our research, what we've learned so far, and that's from hearing from young people, as well as the challenges that have been associated with the implementation. My current perspective on COB, for whatever that's worth, and I'm going to end with a few discussion questions to stimulate some thoughts about this. So the COB has several layers from the government, the federal government, all the way to the recipient. So it starts as a Canada housing benefit. The Canada housing benefit is worked out in partnership with the provinces and territories. So in Ontario, that becomes the Canada-Ontario Housing Benefit, i.e. COB. In Toronto, that goes to the municipal government, who decides what's happening in the city and how it should be distributed. That then goes to the community agencies, who decides who should receive it based on who they're seeing, and then it goes to the recipients, or in our case that we're talking about is young people. So what could possibly go wrong, right? In the city of Toronto, who gets COB, there are 4 streams of folks that get COB. The 70% of funding goes to the shelter relief stream, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's the emergency shelter system. 20% goes to the Indigenous stream. 5% goes to survivors of domestic violence and human trafficking, and another 5% go to the centralized waitlist for large families. For the young people that receive it in the city of Toronto, there are 42 different agencies that have received COB and provided to youth. They're not all youth serving, but they have young people accessing their services. It depends on how many beds they have. So the more beds you have, the more COB benefits you get. And they determine who gets those benefits. So at Covenant House, where I work, they look at the by name list, see who's been in shelter the longest, and those folks are prioritized for the COB benefit. The only eligibility requirement is that they are homeless for 3 to 6 months. And I have a range there because that's changed year by year. Originally, they started with 3 months requirement, and now it's 6 months to try to prioritize the chronically homeless. They must have legal status, and they must agree to remove their names from the social wait list. That has changed for those who are on priority, like survivors of domestic violence, but everyone else has to agree to remove themselves from that wait list. In this last year, we're in year 4 of this benefit. And so initially, the city received $9.5 million. They then received a top-up fund of $26.48 million. And young people received between 13 and 17% of these COB benefits. The demographic distribution, 81% of the young people identified as Black, 86% identified as refugees. And in terms of the amount they received, the average benefit was $1,208, and that's compared to the average rent of $1,687. So that left them with about a $500 windfall to pay for rent. So obviously the potential to assist young people experiencing homelessness, a quote from a staff member, COB houses people who would not be otherwise not be housed and in places they would not have access to. The shelter system in Toronto, the youth sector is 100% full all the time right now, and it takes a really long time for folks to move out. And that's because young people cannot afford housing. They don't have the earning potential to afford housing. So this gives folks a way to house young people. So they're housing people who have very few options. And not only does it give them access to housing, but for many years, which Ada will talk a little bit about the impact that has for young people. So given this potential, we are funded by the Canadian Mortgage Housing Corporation to study the impact of COB on the lives of youth experiencing homelessness. And the very short title is Life on COB, the impact of a portable, multi-year, rent-geared to income rent subsidy on the lives of youth experiencing homelessness. All right. Ada, would you like to talk about our study?
Yes. All right, so in short, the title is Life on COB. And we have 3 overall research objectives for our project. And so the first one is to understand just the preliminary outcomes of COB on the lives of youth who have experienced homelessness and identify which services and supports should complement COB. So this includes a consideration of how these services could be tailored to meet the unique needs of subpopulations. So this can include Black youth, for example, or newcomers, which we've seen a more recent influx of over these past few years. Second, we want to identify critical success factors and challenges and unintended consequences that arose during the implementation of COB. So what's working, what's not working, what's kind of popping up that we didn't really anticipate with COB. And finally, we want to synthesize evidence and consult policy experts across Canada and potentially internationally to provide guidance and recommendations on the use of COB, specifically as part of an overall strategy to address youth homelessness. So for these research objectives, we have our data collection, and right now we're currently in phase 1. And so we're doing guided surveys with youth. And what that means is we have a survey, and it's on a survey platform, but it's guided and sort of an interview approach with them. So we're explaining what we're asking, we're following up and elaborating, and some of our participants, English may be their second language. So this also gives us the opportunity just to make sure that they're understanding what we're asking, and so we can get a full picture of what their experiences with COB are. So we're asking things like what could be more helpful, what would be easier, and just our overall experience applying with COB. And in phase 1, we're also interviewing staff and other stakeholders who are involved with distributing COB. And so we're learning about their expertise, their experience with COB, the processes, how they're supporting youth, what that looks like, any perceived impacts they may have, and trends and recommendations. And so for phase 2, which we're hoping is going to start in early 2025, it's going to consist of focus groups with youth and focus groups with policy experts. So the youth that we want to have focus groups with, these are the youth that we conducted the guided survey with. We're asking for their consent if this is something they'd like to participate in, which would then be a focus group with other youth who have taken the survey. And we want to have 3 focus groups in total at each of our partnering agencies. And the focus groups the discussion is going to be informed by all of our findings from phase 1 data. And essentially just the basics of how COB has impacted their lives for youth. And for the policy experts, it's also going to be informed by our findings in phase one, but we're also going to speak to them about regional variation, since this is across Canada, and identifying what elements of the policies are actually effective, where they can be strengthened, and we want to identify short, mid, and long-term opportunities and challenges related to COB, and particularly just as part of our overall strategy to address youth homelessness. So in terms of our project and potential application and use, so to our knowledge, there's not a lot of research has examined the efficacy of COB and in facilitating housing stability among youth. So we want to see if how receiving this benefit positively impacts other areas of their lives that we haven't read about, such as their employment, education, their mental health and well-being, and if there are potential areas of improvements overall. And questions also remain just about how youth may benefit from additional services, as I touched on before, and supports paired with COB. So this could be a YIT worker, for example, and how these may be tailored to best meet the unique needs of subpopulations. So, for instance, in the City of Toronto, as I said before, an unprecedented number of newcomers have entered the emergency shelter system. So looking at their unique needs that this population might have, which could be understanding tenant laws more thoroughly. So what we've learned so far, at our agency, Covenant House Toronto, we've learned that there is an increase in housing stability for recipients, and at our agency, it's increased by 30%. We've also learned that it allows recipients to afford a place that meets their needs. So something that's come up is they can afford a place that they feel safe in, and that they may have access to all of their daily and immediate needs, or it's closer to public transportation where they can still easily access it if it is a little bit further. And we've also learned that it allows recipients to focus more on other areas of their lives. So for example, going back to school, looking at other training programs that might strengthen their resume, and trying to find a new job that's in a field that they are interested in, and their mental health and well-being, and also any legal hearings for the newcomers. And one youth that we did spoke to let us know that just about the general impact that COB has had on their lives. They said that since I have COB, I have more time to get training programs, look for what I want, and then eventually get the job. And I'll pass it back to Amanda. She'll talk about the challenges.
Okay, I'm sure you'll all be shocked to know that there are some challenges. Starting is that the city is often waiting to hear from the province if and when they're going to get COB renewed. They generally don't know when they're going to get it or how much, and that trickles down to the agencies. So the agencies don't know when they're going to get COB, they don't know how much they're going to get. There was a period in year 4 where there was a 6-month, I guess for all intents and purposes, a stalemate between the feds and the province in trying to meet matching commitments. I'm sure you guys are really shocked, and I'm glad you're sitting down, that there are some tensions between the federal and provincial governments. And so I would say there's also some uncertainty, like what's going to happen after 2029. So that's when the funding runs out completely. And we're unclear at this point if recipients are expected to then be able to pay market rent, or if there's going to be some kind of renewal. There have been some reports of bureaucratic barriers, both in applying for COB and renewing it. So every year recipients have to renew, and they must file their taxes to determine eligibility. And the city was saying that they had about 10% of folks who dropped off who were eligible for COB but couldn't renew it because of some of these bureaucratic processes. So I guess one positive thing that happened between the stalemate for province and federal government is the city created a renewal strategy, and were able to target folks, and they got that down to 4%. Having COB really depends on having the agency capacity and particular dedicated housing staff. So especially for young people experiencing homelessness, looking for housing, securing housing, advocating with landlords, that really does require the support of the staff. As well as you saw that we had about 80% that were newcomers. They don't know Ontario tenancies and laws, etc. So having folks that can provide that kind of education to young people is really important. But of course, not all agencies have dedicated housing workers, so they don't necessarily have this support. So that makes implementing COB pretty challenging. Barriers with landlords. So there's a lot of landlords who don't know what COB is, so they need sort of that education on what it is. They may become skeptical. There may be stigma around a government subsidy, particularly with young people in general, and if they're on ODSP or OW, there is that stigma. And a really sort of negative, unanticipated consequence is that some landlords hear about COB and increase their rent. So they try to maximize the amount that they're going to get, and they increase their rent. So some of the unanticipated consequences that we've seen in our shelter system, in terms of the young people, like this, it's almost a lottery of who's gonna get COB, right? So the young people are all waiting, they hear that there's COB benefits, they're really excited, they'll all flock to the agency that has COB, they'll all be waiting. But this is, you saw the slide at the beginning, there was 100,000 people either on the wait list or in shelter system. And the city has given out 6,000 COB benefits total, so that's 6% of the need, right? So it's a little bit of a lottery. And while youth are waiting for this, sometimes they will turn down other options because they want COB. And I don't blame them. It's a very attractive benefit. So transitional housing, other subsidized units. And then when the funding runs out, they are left with nothing because they were waiting for COB. So that's definitely been an unanticipated consequence. And, you know, we talk about demand side, we're still relying on the market. So, you know, I don't know this for sure, there's no evidence yet, but if landlords start raising the rents, that could inflate the market, which could then make it more difficult for folks who don't get COB. We're also not doing anything about tenants or about rent raising laws or anything about putting the supply side housing in the ground. So, in conclusion, my emerging take on COB is that it is a fantastic rent subsidy and has the potential to make a true impact in the lives of youth who are homeless. But that is for those who receive it. And if only a very small percentage of young people can receive it, who should receive it? And I don't know the answer to that. There are folks who would argue that the higher functioning folks who don't need as much support but just need that financial help should receive it. And there are folks who argue that the chronically homeless should be prioritized. I don't know the answer to that. I worry about the unanticipated consequences like inflating the market. And I also wonder, is this a Band-Aid that's not really addressing the underlying affordability crisis? I don't know if it's addressing the right part of the problem, and I don't know if it's addressing the right problem altogether. So it's great, but there are problems. So my discussion questions for you all. Who should be prioritized and why? The chronically homeless or those with relatively fewer barriers other than affordability? Is it realistic to expect COB recipients to be able, or what is to expect after 2029? Should they be working towards being able to afford average market rent now? What's going to happen in 2029? And what can we do to mitigate some of the market forces that may lead to the unanticipated consequences? Thank you. Do we want to, what do we? Okay. Come sit beside me, Nick.
COB is the same as the PSL.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
But it
it's
was
the
only,
same
you were
thing.
only $100, right? Or 100
No,
and
that was a different one.
All right, thank you so much to all our presenters. We're going to take questions now. We've got about 20 minutes. Please.
Sorry. Hello, my name is Kat and I'm from Manitoba. Not necessarily a question, but I was very it's not a good sentence. I'm very interested that I saw COB, because Manitoba has CMHB. I just wondered, in the last couple of months, the provincial government actually paused CMHB, which led to at least 500 people not being able to afford to get into housing. So I just wondered if there was any thought in making sure that didn't happen in Toronto. If it's something you've thought about, or if this is like the first time you heard about it, I also just wanted to put it out there that that happened. It did get restarted. It's not supposed to end until March 2028. So we're still quite worried in Manitoba that it's not going to last that long.
Already receiving it, stopped receiving it? Or they just couldn't get new folks in there?
New.
Okay.
Yeah, the individuals who are getting it were okay,
Okay.
but no new folks.
I mean, I think that's the perpetual uncertainty that we're left with all the time, not knowing when it's coming. And so the city is at the mercy of the province, which sounds like perhaps you are as well. So I think that's kind of one of the main challenges, is that, like, when are we going to get it? How much are we going to get it? And what are we going to do when we don't have it? Because the housing workers that we work with say that without a subsidy, like, the youth, they don't move. Like, there's nowhere for them to go. So that creates, we're so slammed. We have respite beds. We are just trying to meet the demand all the time. And it's, so yes, we worry about that all the time. And I'm sorry that happened. Yeah. And I don't know the answer to that.
I've got the mic. Hi. I'm Jackie Kennelly. I'm a researcher at Carleton University here in Ottawa, and thank you for all the presentations. I kind of have questions for everyone, most like urgent and relevant to the work I'm doing with Amanda. We should talk more after. Okay, I want to be inclusive also, because I really do have questions for everyone. So I'm wondering, with the first presentation, about the role, if there was any, because often I think an issue for people who are experiencing homelessness, certainly young people I've worked with, in terms of accessing banks and financial stuff, is ID. And I was just wondering, it's just a small question about that. I'm going to ask two more, and then I'm going to relinquish the mic. Amanda, I've been involved with a national study. We really need to talk more, but in Cape Breton, we were looking at the impact of the Canada Housing Benefit, and it's called something different there in Nova Scotia. And one of the impacts, it was a mess. And what ended up happening is people were transferred onto the CHB, or whatever it's called there, and then taken off the local rent supplement. They ended up with less money because it was indexed to market rent, but the market rent wasn't accurate. There were just all sorts of messy things. So I'm curious, you've got a pretty positive set of experiences here, and I'm just wondering, maybe they've improved it since Cape Breton fucked it up so badly, but and the study on the Quebec, similar questions about the kind of, I think you're talking about, or are you talking about Canada Housing Benefit? What was that in the mix? And did you see any of those?
What we call the Programme Supplément de Loyer is the same as the it's
the Quebec
like the
version.
COB. It's like the COB. Yeah.
So similar question then. If you saw other kinds of perverse consequences of it, like replacing an older benefit and then people losing benefits or losing housing.
Yeah.
Okay, my answer is quick. Yes. We do a lot of support of doing. We do like 1,500 to 2,000 taxes a year for people getting their ID cards, like all that stuff. Yeah, for sure.
I think I presented a relatively positive view because it's so much better than everything else out there. But there's definitely some criticism around the amount. And the average market rent is determined by CMHC. It's not necessarily what they're actually paying for rent. So what that works out to be is some people are unfortunate and have a huge gap. And then some people actually get more COB than they're Supposed to, yeah. So it's definitely not a perfect system, and I think I would love to talk to you about it because this is going to look different across based on the provincial and different agreements. Yeah.
In terms of kind of the impact of the rent supplement on rents, which is one thing one might be concerned about, there has been quite a bit of literature on that. In our context, my impression is that kind of you don't hear of that having very much of an impact. I mean, there's not that many people who get that benefit. Like if everybody were given an extra $1,000 a month towards rent, it clearly would have an impact on rents. But when it's just a relatively small portion of the market who get an amount, it's not clear it's going to have that much of an impact. So we're not that concerned about that, and there hasn't been the kind of effect that you described in Cape Breton, where once people got this, they were kicked off another benefit. There hasn't been another benefit like that to be kicked off. I guess the other thing I would say is connecting with what Nick was saying, like whether it's called the COB or the PSL or whatever, that housing benefit is part of the demand side approach. If you look at a country like Finland that has been very effective at reducing homelessness, they've really relied on the combination of like a generous housing benefit, generous and flexible and adjustable, that takes into account a lot of parameters, with like investing more and more into the development of housing that is like outside the market. So the combination of the two seems to be at least one potential winning solution to bring homelessness way down. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you. Marie-Sophie Banville, I'm a housing consultant. I have two questions. La première, vous avez ouvert la porte à des questions nerd. Donc, j'ai une question nerd pour vous. La gestion des liquidités de la fiducie, étant donné que ça fonctionne à l'échelle régionale, j'aurais aimé en savoir un peu plus sur comment ça a été. J'ai une autre question après, donc je vais poser les deux. Gestion des liquidités de la fiducie. And also for I was really surprised by having to take your name out of the social housing waiting list to have the benefit. If you know more about like the policy rationale behind that decision, and are all housing benefits incompatible with social housing, accessing social housing in Ontario? So these are my two questions. Merci.
Est-ce que ça fonctionne? Oui. So I'm going to talk about liquidité in English. Is that okay? Oh, yeah. Okay. So it's an issue. Right now we're in a pilot project, and we got a very small amount of funding for the project. So we're launching 5 sites in 2 years. And so right now, Accueil Bonneau actually moves money from our bank accounts to make sure there's money. So what happens is a participant in the fiducie signs their consent that we will receive their check. It comes into our account, but when it comes in is a crapshoot. And so if we need to make sure their rent is paid, we'll move money into that account. So we're working with the Caisse d'économie solidaire to see if we can get a fund that can sit in the account and be used as needed.
Like a credit line?
Yeah, exactly. Because it's getting bigger. So we used to just be like moving $100,000 a week. Now it's growing. Yeah.
I can't speak to the whole province because these are municipal policies. But in the city of Toronto, the rationale was around trying to reduce the folks that are on the wait list. And because there's 93 active households on the list, and the wait list for folks who aren't on priority are 10 to 20 years. So I think the idea was really to try to reduce that and to provide another option for them. I do think municipally you do have to pick one or the other. I don't know about all of the rent subsidies, but you generally can only get one. Yeah.
Hello, I just talk till it goes? Okay, cool, thanks folks. Sarah Button, I'm the Executive Director of Centertown Citizens Ottawa Corporation, CCOC here. So we're a housing provider, and so this is more of an observation and a general comment that I wanted to say on the mic because I think everybody in the room might be interested, and so I apologize because people do this in conferences and now I'm that person. But there was a session earlier with some things from Ottawa about portable benefits, this enhanced housing benefit that the City of Ottawa has done to rapidly rehouse folks from the physical distancing centers, and another one that was an organization that's serving refugee households. And so I have a perspective on this coming from the housing provider side, where in Ottawa, folks receiving COB are going into social housing. So we're an affordable housing provider with a mixed income model. And so that is having, like, boy howdy, unintended adverse impacts, unexpected adverse impacts. And maybe this is a conversation for another time. But what I'm finding really interesting here is that folks are exploring these portable benefits, right? We've layered in this demand side thing to what is mostly a supply side approach in the country. We're doing both of them at woefully inadequate levels, but we're layering in this demand side thing to what has mostly been a supply side thing, at least in the jurisdictions I've worked in. And it is precipitating all of these interesting impacts. And now it's been running long enough that we're starting to find out what they are. And some of them I think are anticipated, like landlords wanting to increase the rent so that they can get more of this COB money. But some of them I think are a little bit more surprising. And this is like a pitch for a future thing where all the folks who are studying this and looking at this and starting to identify these emerging trends get together and do a whole panel on this at another, maybe it's next year at CAH or at CHRA conference or something like that. Because I think there is so much that could be shared from the way this is rolling out in different jurisdictions, because we know we have to do more of all of the things. And I think we're starting to have the lessons that we can start to apply in whatever the next iteration of the demand side thing is. That's all, thank you.
Hello, thanks for the presentations, they're wonderful. Going back to what you're saying actually in the demand side, supply side kind of dichotomy, correct me if I'm wrong, if the Finnish formula is considered, and the rent subsidy based on the Finnish formula is a subsidy that's determined by the square footage of someone renting, and like based on square footage, that's how the subsidy is allocated by that. Is there any way to flip it onto the supply side and mandate some sort of rent control that is determined by the square footage?
Be saying for an apartment of this size, in a building of this age, in this type of region, the maximum rent should be this much. Well, in theory,
we have that for the OMHM approved places. Like there's an amount for, depending on the size of the unit.
yes, there is an amount, but it doesn't take into account all of those parameters, to my knowledge.
It's based on how many bedrooms,
Okay.
right?
How many bedrooms?
But that's not for, yeah, it is.
Essentially, we're penalizing the demand side for more space.
Yep.
But instead, we should mandate a rent control on the supply side because the property is larger and we can appropriate a higher rent to give them more money because it's a larger place, but actually control the rent when there's less space for the tenant.
Yeah, in effect, what you're saying is kind of, why don't we apply more pressure on the rents that landlords are asking.
Based on square footage, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah,
Is that possible?
Yeah, I think it's totally reasonable. I mean, it goes in a direction of intervening with the financialization that's been going on in the housing market. Those with capital have been finding a way to increase the returns on their capital by using the housing sector. So it is possible to introduce regulation into that process. Whenever you start regulating the supply of something, you have to worry about potential negative consequences. So I would be cautious about introducing a radical reform all over the place very rapidly. I would be inclined to go progressively and adjust on the basis of the effects that are observed. But totally, I think it makes sense for governments to intervene on the rent side of the market. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I mean, our premier took that away, so our rent control. So I'm not holding my breath. Yeah.
If I can just make one more comment to clarify a little bit what you've been listening to, just to contrast the way it works in Ontario with the way it works in Quebec. So as I mentioned, the PSL is equivalent to the COB. The way it works in Ontario, the money goes through municipalities, as you were describing. In Quebec, it goes through an entity that we called l'Office d'Habitation, so the housing office, which is a non-profit. There's one in every municipality, basically. And they have their own rules. They also manage all the social housing. So it's kind of natural that they would have interpreted the money that comes from the same federal source at root that gave us the Canada-Ontario housing benefit or the Canada-Manitoba housing benefit. That same money went to Quebec, but it goes through these offices d'habitation, which manage all the government-run social housing, what we call the HLM in Quebec. So they manage that. So it was natural for them to conceive of the rent supplement as being used to extend the capacity of apartments, of housing units that are under its control. Whereas in Ontario, I think there isn't that same sense that the money has to be attached to a housing unit. It follows the person, doesn't it?
No, you have to have an intention to rent. Oh, but you mean, yeah.
It's not the
But
actual building and unit.
No.
It's the person who gets it.
It's the person.
Right,
Yeah.
so that's the difference. Sorry, I didn't quite hear your point.
Thanks. If they have to manage their portfolio, so I guess what you're saying is the subsidy is attached to the property, right?
Yes, the subsidy is attached to the apartment.
To the property, right? So that makes it even easier to mandate the rent because they're controlling the property over the subsidy. Sorry?
If you have a rent registry, we've been talking about having registry for ages, but you have to actually know what's being charged.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, it's attached to the apartment, but what the Office d'Habitation transfers is a set amount that has a ceiling.
Okay.
So the landlord can decide this apartment is $1,600 a month, but the rent supplement is a maximum of, let's say, $900. So it's going to be, in effect, unaffordable for somebody who's on social assistance. So therefore, you can't access that apartment for a population that's on social assistance.
Yes, I think what I'm trying to say is the rent should have a ceiling, not the subsidy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, ideally, as I was saying. Yes.
Oui.
We're somewhat anti-capitalist here.
Oui. Est-ce que vous préférez que je la pose en français ou en anglais? OK. Je me demandais si vous aviez vu un impact, dans le fond, pour la fiducie volontaire, si vous aviez vu un impact sur l'accès au logement. Parce que, dans le fond, pour les gens qui sont en situation d'itinérance, quand il y a un logement qui devient disponible, il y a tellement de monde qui veulent avoir ce logement-là que souvent, ils sont victimes de discrimination. Le fait qu'une des premières dépenses qui est payée, dans le fond, la première dépense qui est payée, c'est le loyer. Est-ce que ça a un impact sur l'accès au logement ou s'il y a encore de la discrimination envers les personnes en situation d'itinérance?
Bien, merci pour la question, mais honnêtement, on ne l'a pas mesuré, on n'a pas constaté de différence encore parmi nos participants. Ce qu'on essaie de faire, c'est de prévenir un retour à la rue ou une première expérience en s'assurant que leur loyer soit payé. Mais non, on n'a pas vu ça jusqu'à présent. C'est pas quelque chose qu'on a mesuré encore. Do you want to add anything?
Et j'ajouterais qu'au début, les personnes qui ont fait partie du programme sont nos résidents donc c'est des personnes qui étaient déjà en logement.
On commence maintenant avec la fiducie régionale d'accueillir des gens qui sont en situation d'itinérance. Donc, c'est quelque chose qu'il va falloir qu'on évalue. Oui, ça se peut que ce soit aussi parce qu'ils sont déjà accompagnés. Alors, ils ont un intervenant qui est en lien avec les organismes et tout. Vous êtes situé où? À Granby. On pourrait se parler parce que effectivement, il y a plusieurs fiducies n'ont aucun financement, aucune ressource. Et c'est ça qu'on essaye de mettre en place, quelque chose qui coûte très peu au point de service, puis le modèle d'affaires qu'on n'a pas mentionné, un élément, c'est qu'on a un financement qu'on accorde au point de service. Donc, on reçoit un financement du gouvernement, on en donne au point de service pour qu'ils puissent opérer puis avoir du staff dédié.
Des problèmes qu'on a eu avec la fiducie volontaire, c'est qu'il y avait beaucoup de négociations avec les usagers au niveau de l'argent qui restait. Et en même temps, c'est leur argent, mais là, dans le fond, mettons, on s'entendait sur un montant chaque semaine, mais il revenait à tous les jours pour avoir... Est-ce que vous arrivez à régler ça ou c'est encore...
Comme vous dites, c'est leur argent et c'est volontaire. Alors, à tout moment, ils pourront décider de retirer leur argent puis ne plus participer. Puis avec les documents qu'on signe avec eux, que Maxime a développés, on leur donne une semaine ou... Ils doivent attendre une semaine pour retirer leur argent de façon comme complète. Mais non, normalement, c'est pas si problématique que ça.
C'est une entente.
Beaucoup de temps.
C'est selon le choix de la personne qui participe. Donc, comme j'ai mentionné, c'est possible que la personne vienne le 1er du mois et retire tout le reste de l'argent le 1er du mois. Mais ça peut arriver qu'elle ait décidé que ça serait un montant par mois, par semaine. Mais c'est selon sa volonté.
Et on a identifié 4 profils d'usagers. Donc, ceux qui viennent souvent, comme dit Nathalie, et d'autres que c'est 1 ou 2 transactions par mois. Puis, on les gère selon leur volonté.
Merci tout le monde. Thank you so much, everyone who came. It was a lovely session. And see you all tomorrow.